Development webinar series for nonprofits and organizations that are cause-driven. Today, we're going to be talking about crisis and resilience and how we can move beyond crisis. We're going to talk about strategies, and I'm really excited to have a guest speaker today. I'm just going to make sure I'm screen sharing. Yeah, everything looks good. Alrighty. So we always start with a territorial acknowledgement. I just like to acknowledge with gratitude that we're working, living, and playing on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. And I myself am in New Westminster, British Columbia, so that's on the Kakite Nation. And we have people joining us from across the country and the US. So we always like to just talk a little bit about the Indigenous peoples from where we're calling from today. It's a real pleasure and treat to introduce Catarina Moreno. She and I have known each other for a couple of years, but we've met in the Vancouver Tech for Good meetup, and we instantly hit it off. So I'm super excited to work and collaborate with you, especially now that you've moved into this role as a consultant for Ignite Management. And you do a lot of work facilitating, working with people, working with organizations and organizational development. But I'm really excited to have your 15 plus years of experience today. I know you've worked in nonprofit organizations, and you've done everything from being a board chair of environmental groups in the province to you've been an interim executive director. So I know you have lots of experience from both the board, volunteer, employee, and consulting side in terms of how nonprofits work. So that's awesome. Did I forget to mention anything that you'd like to add, Catarina?
No, that sounds great. I would want to know myself. So thank you. Glad to be here.
I really enjoy chatting with you, and I think others will enjoy it today. Today will be a little bit informal. And I'm, of course, Leah Chang. I founded Leah Chang Learning. And what we do as an organization is we support nonprofits and cause-driven businesses to support your learning and development, your client education, and your internal training needs. And we'll be talking a little bit about the services and products that we offer today. And just wondering why I'm not able to move forward. Here we go. Okay. Quick reminder, just some housekeeping. There might be some polls and chats today, so please feel free to participate. This is a webinar format, so your video and your mic will not be on. And there's a post-webinar survey. We'd love to get your feedback. We always want to improve, and we want to know if we're reaching and meeting your needs. Today's webinar is recorded as usual. We usually post a blog summary, so please be sure to share it with others if you find it useful. And if you have to step out early, no worries. You can always watch the recording. We're gonna also share our email and our social media accounts with you. We'd love to stay connected after this webinar. So if you're shy or we run out of time today, please email us and we'd be happy to get back to you after. I'm super excited to say that LearnUpon Learning Management System is the sponsor of our free webinar series. And thanks to their sponsorship, we're able to bring this to you for free. Learning management systems are hot topics these days, right? And so the reason we chose LearnUpon as our sponsor and also as our LMS of choice is, well, we've got lots of reasons. Just going to pass those on right now. Not only are they a fantastic platform for training employees, volunteers, board members, or clients, but it's an amazing and very robust learning management system that allows nonprofits to really partner, scale, and also provide excellent quality experience. So one of the things I love about LearnUpon is that they have multiple portals. So if you have a learning management system that you can share or partition with other partner organizations, it's very cost effective. So you get access to a great product, really robust system, but you can share it with other organizations. The learning experience from a learner perspective, but also as a user and administrator is fantastic. It's really easy to navigate and it's very scalable. So I'm using it with organizations that maybe have, 10 users up to organizations with thousands of users. And they're real people. I love the company. They are super responsive, supportive. They give a great onboarding experience and really want to support what they're doing too. So if you have questions about LearnUpon, you can always contact me. It's really exciting. That's what we use for our learning management system with our courses. Just a real quick sort of framing of why we do this free webinar series. Catarina and I have both been board members, volunteers. We've worked as employees of nonprofits. I'm sure a lot of us are also donors and clients and constituents of nonprofits. And something that we realize is that everyone that contributes to making an organization run successfully needs growth and needs support. And so one thing that lots of scrappy and lean nonprofits are not able to provide is a little bit of human resources support or learning and development support. And so that's what we're trying to aim for today. By ensuring that we're thinking of the learning needs and the organizational growth as a whole, we can help the whole community of your nonprofit move forward. That could mean developing learning internally or developing capacity externally, depending on your mandate. And of course, we want to support you with the great work you're doing, especially right now, because oh boy, 2020 has given us a real set of challenges. So we're going to talk about that today. All right, I might pass it over to Catarina really quickly. Do you want to just run through the objectives? I have to grab a quick glass of water, but you go for it.
Absolutely. So today, this being a very jam-packed webinar, we'll start off with just touching on the concept of crisis as a linear versus a cyclical event. That might be pointing out the obvious, but still worth touching on. Then we'll move into how to build your resiliency muscle. We'll look at a few related concepts. Then we'll look at some very straightforward techniques / tools that you can use for your contingency planning, and follow it up with a few more activities. And that should wrap us up.
Great. Well, let's get started then. Thanks for the little introduction. And I'll pass it over to you now. I think this is your first slide.
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, right now, all our minds are on COVID, mainly because it has involved lots of shutdowns. It has very much affected how we can do our work. And so, again, this might be pointing out the obvious, but just the definition of a crisis, it being an extremely difficult or dangerous point in a situation. So where I want to go with this, I want to make an emphasis on the point, the word of point in this definition. And if we go to the next slide, this leads us into the thinking of, okay, right now, of course, our minds are preoccupied by COVID and its impacts on us. But if we zoom out a little bit and think about crises, other crises that can hit us, oftentimes the way it goes or it feels is that we're chugging along fairly clearly focused on our impact, our mission and whatnot, and then something happens, something unforeseen or mostly unforeseen, and then all hell breaks loose. We scramble to go into crisis response, we adjust, we mobilize maybe funds, maybe people, maybe knowledge, and scramble, and then slowly either get back to our new normal, which is a term that I'm sure a lot of us are quite sick of by now. And then at some point it stabilizes again and we start chugging again in a different way. And oftentimes that might feel, so again, it's that one point of the crisis, and it might feel linear, and it might feel as if, oh, we just have to get through that one crisis and then things are good again. But zooming out, we can see that this is not really the case, but then that there can be lots of other crises that can hit us. It can either be a larger external crisis, like, for example, a general recession. It can be any political changes that might affect certain organizations, or it can also be something internal, for example, an accident that somebody has on our premises, and internally that is a crisis. So zooming out, we quickly find that it's actually a circle or a cycle where we go from chugging along to something happening, some external threat occurring, us responding, we slowly recovering and getting back into a thrive mode until really the next crisis, smaller or bigger, hits. So I think, again, as much as that might be pointing out the obvious, it really helps and provides the foundation for the rest of this webinar, to think about it as an ongoing exercise, because in the end it comes down to resilience. Back to you, Leah.
Thanks. Let's take a really quick poll. And I like those two images of, do you see crisis as linear? Is it cyclical? And how does that approach change how resilient you can be? So I'm kind of curious if we could do a quick poll. Let's just see, where is your organization at right now? Are you still in the thick of it? Are you just starting to get your breath? Or, are you strong? Are you sort of leading the pack? Are you kind of well positioned? And it's okay if you're not sure where you're at either. So we're just going to leave it a few more seconds. And again, this might change by the day or even by the hour. So that's all right too, if you're not sure how to answer. We're really just curious. Okay, I think that's pretty good, Sharon. Thanks for launching the poll. Curious if we can see some of the results. If you want to show those. Oh, interesting. So most of the respondents have said that, they're still in crisis mode. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of wave 2, or perhaps even in the first wave, depending on where you're calling from today. So we also see people are in a position of strength. That's right. A lot of organizations who have built in that resiliency from the beginning and have the infrastructure to support are actually in a position of leadership right now and strength. So that's great. We're seeing two ends of the spectrum. Okay, thank you for sharing. We can close those. So Catarina, how do you know when you're getting past the crisis? Because that's what we're going to focus on today, right? What are some of the signs that we see?
Yeah, so again, and recognizing that right now, different organizations, understanding that we have a very broad audience today, there might be other crises that are hitting your organization, not just COVID. So things that generally we see is that, of course, the internal energy level, so for example, the stress level, how people react to the crisis and just right after, the tension goes up. I mean, there's all the neuroscience that talks about our stress response, and really that we can only keep that the level of heightened alert for so long. All the research into burnout and whatnot that plays into that. So it is really important to recognize that there are physiological effects of stress and crisis. And so as we move out of a crisis, this is when folks maybe sleep better. You might be less conflictual potentially at work, because just in general your stress levels are down. It might also be at a team level that you're starting to be okay to be meeting less often. So business continuity meetings, or just keeping things running meetings, they might not be quite as necessary. I do know some organizations that met every day, or at least 3-4 times a week, and that might ebb out. You might also have some clarity on your budgets, just because you have been working on some projections and now there is a bit more clarity, how things will be shifting. And more importantly, you either have already dealt with, for example, now in COVID times, you have dealt with the relevant health restrictions, and maybe even some cases where you had to have people work from home or cover for people. So knowing what to do in crisis flaring up again, having that practice. So, but there's many ways, and just understanding the up and down, I think that is really important and a great takeaway for leaders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any thoughts or you have your own, input, please use the chat today. We're sort of keeping that open, and it would be nice to see where you're at in terms of how do you know you're moving past the crisis. Yeah, thanks, Catarina. I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble today with a few things, so I hope it's okay for everybody. Thanks, Sharon, for the reminders. Our next section is going to be about how to build resiliency. And of course, as a learning and development professional, we're going to give you some of those tools from a learning perspective. So of course, we can't cover everything today, but one thing we do want to talk about is what is resilience and how do you define it in your organization? And we always want to make sure we're on the same page in terms of how we use the words and And of course, words matter. And so in this case, we're going to talk about resilience from a psychological perspective. And psychologists view resilience as adapting well in the face of all those things that can happen, be that adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats. And those can be on an organizational level, an individual level, team level. And so I want you to think about resilience in that framework of how psychologists view it. And, maybe we'll skip the poll, but I'd like you to think of this phrase. It's a phrase that I've sort of put together on my own, but I'm sure that it resonates with you, or perhaps it doesn't. I'm kind of curious, is today's new normal, and as Catarina said at the beginning, we're getting a little sick of that term, but it's true. We're facing a very different world, right? And perhaps what this world requires is continually building resilience. And I'm going to sort of ask you to keep that phrase in your mind today as we go through some of the activities and strategies that we're going to recommend. Building resilience is about building capacity, building cognitive strength, emotional strength. There's so many things, right? And how does that translate to a nonprofit organization? So we'll take a quick look at that. And thanks, Erin, for popping into the chat. If you agree or disagree, or if you're not sure what this means, feel free to share. It's all about evoking some thought today. So I'd like to, and I love to use analogies. As a learning professional, we always use analogies. Analogies help us connect, concepts. But I want you to think about, how you're building muscle, tone, strength, and ongoing muscle. So, let's take that analogy a little further. So we know that building muscle is about repetition, the frequency that we're working out in. It's about the nutrition, the input that we put in. Are we eating properly? Do we get enough protein, amino acids? How much support and encouragement? Like, do you have a personal trainer as you're building muscle? And especially for women, we're always considering, how are we doing weight-bearing activities? Are we adding complexity to our workout? So I want you to think of that analogy of building muscle in terms of how we're going to apply the strategies today to building resiliency. And I know that Catarina has some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so just building absolutely on that analogy, I really like it too. Thinking about it on a personal level now, translating it to the organizational level. Because all the tools and techniques, the ones that we share with you today, are also other ones that you might be using or you might be finding as you travel the web. They can only happen on a solid foundation. They're never silver bullets. Just like going to the gym once is not going to make you happy and healthy, or eating a salad once is not going to cancel out maybe the junk food that we might be eating in times of lockdown. So thinking about really building those habits, building those practices, specifically when we're not in crisis. So it really is about, at an organizational level, about building a solid foundation, which can include, and these are just some ideas, there's many, many more, and a lot of them will be much more specific to your organization, but is building and fostering a culture of flexibility and adaptation. And that it can include how you maybe have meetings, how you discuss things. It can include diversifying decision-making. So thinking about, is your organization, maybe not necessarily via org chart, but the practices, how you make decisions, is it very top-down? Is it one person who holds most relationships and most knowledge and calls the shots? Or is it decentralized, which oftentimes it can take more time, but what you achieve by that is more people knowing why things happen, diversity of perspectives, and also if one person steps away or has to step away, then the system doesn't crumble or the organization doesn't crumble. And another one could be fostering multiple communication channels with your community. So as we've been seeing now in terms of COVID, how do we still provide services, maybe in modified ways, but how do we still provide our services to our communities and engage with them to find out how their needs have changed? So there's many, many different ones, and I'm just peeking on my notes here, that help us to build that solid foundation and to create an adaptive culture. And I think maybe before I finish that point, also being really clear on having a clear strategy. I know this means for some to have a strategic plan, but it can also just mean knowing your direction, whatever format that might take, knowing what are your principles and your values that drive you, because then it's a lot easier to pivot in terms of another one of those terms that we're all quite sick of. But it's so much easier to pivot in terms maybe of activities or ways of how to engage with your community, but knowing that there is a north, you're staying true to your vision or your mission or your values and principles. So that helps as well to do that in times of non-crisis, to build resilience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about when you do these things. And so from a learning perspective, we always base it on learning science, how the brain learns best, how we create those neural pathways. These are some of the musts that we know about resiliency from a learning perspective, is we need to use scenarios that are authentic, scenarios that relate directly to your team. So on the right, you have an image here of a women's team here. And I'm going to ask you a question. Do you ever use drills with your teams? Do you use drills on your board? Do you talk about these things in advance? If you're not identifying the potential scenarios and practicing how you would address them, there's no way that we can expect a team to be ready for the crisis or to be ready if that scenario actually did happen. So here's an activity that we recommend is, practice that, drill that, take 2 to 3 scenarios and walk through them with your teams, but then you need to debrief, explain and point out why are we doing it this way, and decide together, what's the best way to react in this situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study, and I'm going to use the word toggle. And I like to use a lot of analogies with sort of digital language, but I want you to think about, when are you responding and when are you reacting? When does the team need to be reactive, and when does the team need to sort of take some time and be more responsive in a proactive way? And of course, wherever we can, we should favor proactivity. We should favor being prepared. And that's kind of the whole point of what we're talking about today. So here's a quick case study. I'm a huge fan of Charles Duhigg. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is an interesting book. Chapter 3 in particular talks about how to avoid tunnel vision. And in the chapter, there's some pretty scary stories about, how, Air France Airbus 447 went down and people perished. There's other stories about how nurses in ICU, can identify when an infant is in distress, even though none of the typical signals are sort of going off. The idea here is that this book focuses on, how does the brain work, and what are some traps that we can fall into as humans? And one of the traps is cognitive tunneling. Cognitive tunneling is when you're in a crisis, bam, something scary happens, or bam, you get a really you get a big email, or you have a huge meeting, or someone asks you a question and it's out of the blue. And your brain immediately goes into ultra focus mode. And David Strayer, who's a psychologist at the University of Utah, talks about cognitive tunneling in the sense that sort of like your brain automatically just turns a bright light on one thing. And it doesn't always help to respond to situations this way. And as we know, crisis is now the new normal. How are we practicing opening up our vision? How are we practicing, maintaining a focus that allows our brains to sort of relax and get back into that learning brain, using a different part of our executive functioning instead of just the fight or flight sort of like quick reactive mode, right? So going back to our case study, if you want to learn more, you're welcome to read chapter 3 in particular, but what Charles Duhigg and his research has uncovered is that creating mental models, walking through scenarios, looking at planning ahead for various outcomes, that's the key. So let's look at some strategies on how to do that. I'm going to pass it over to Catarina because she does a lot of facilitation on this, but how would you suggest that organizations plan ahead for multiple outcomes?
Yeah, so maybe just, so I think it's giving away that I think it's a great idea to be planning for multiple outcomes, specifically for what you have just been alluding to, practicing that when you're not in crisis mode. So it feels more natural, or it's easier for you to do even if there is a crisis, because it's so easy to go into crisis response and get that tunnel vision. So just thinking at a very, very high level, when you should be planning for multiple outcomes. If there's any uncertainty, so for example, you're planning a project, program, activity, whatnot, if there is uncertainty in terms of maybe folks who might be attending, or right now around COVID restrictions, this is when it's a good indicator you should be planning for it. If there are needs to be preparing for different outcomes, specifically worse outcomes versus better outcomes, that might be financial, that might be just numbers, that might be whatever indicator is important to you, which then might affect how you can act in that situation. It might also, for example, that your board is asking for different scenarios because they need to then give their okay for certain budgets or whatnot. But then also to manage expectations. Again, it might be the board, it might be funders, it might be community partners or the community itself. So there's a couple of factors that help you know when that is a good idea, always knowing that you don't want to end up in paralysis by analysis and just creating plans and reams of paper or Excel sheets for just the sake of it. That is also not the point. And really, the reason that is important is because it helps you to practice that muscle. So the drills that Leah was talking about, it will give you some kind of idea around things that you have not thought about and that you need to take into consideration. And then it might also show up some gaps, again, things that you maybe haven't thought of. It might highlight certain medium-term additional projects or activities that you should actually consider. Again, always being guided by your overarching, where do we want to go, your strategy, your north, or your vision, keeping that in mind, but then the pivoting can be easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Catarina. I know one way that people may be able to adopt and apply that planning for multiple outcomes technique is to think about, some people are married, or some people have organized a very big event. It could be an anniversary or something like that. So to quote a great Canadian, Alanis Morissette, it's like rain on your wedding day. If you've planned an event that you have invited people from, maybe extended family, that kind of thing, what happens if it rains? Most people have some sort of plan B. So that's a simple way of explaining what contingency planning is. So what can you share with us about that, Catarina? What do you advise organizations to do in terms of that plan B?
Yeah, I mean, contingency is just a fancy word for plan B. I mean, you definitely have heard contingency thrown around a lot now in the COVID context, specifically for many businesses. And it's really what we were just talking about in terms of the thinking through different outcomes. And you can do this definitely for any kind of project, for any program. Usually it is done at the beginning of when you kick off things, again, to glance around you on the basis of the information that you have at hand at that moment. And then there's no reason why you can't regularly be checking in as part of maybe the project updates and whatnot. And of course, if we are in an ongoing crisis like right now with COVID, that would be very important because the external context is changing. But even if not, checking in on that is useful.
Mm-hmm. And right now, as we're facing the second wave in British Columbia, just for those who aren't from here, the context is that banquet halls recently closed. And so a lot of the, small COVID safe weddings or other family events were automatically shut down. Obviously that's not directly related to nonprofits, but we can use that analogy to plan ahead for others, right? And just like you would with wedding planning, if you're planning an outdoor wedding and you don't have a contingency plan for what if it rains, your guests are going to get wet, right? So it's about thinking about those multiple outcomes. And we're going to now get into 5 strategies. I can see some great questions coming into the chat, so thank you. Keep those coming. We're going to save some time to respond to them at the end, but we want to make sure that you have some very concrete tools and tips and examples to take away with you. Activity that you can apply right away with your organization.
Yeah, and I guess that's over to me. And just to say, the question about how to plan for crisis when we're not in crisis, we'll discuss this just in the next slide, just after that one. It's very relevant, and so we'll touch on that. Okay, so the one very, very simple technique that you can do around building resilience, or that Plan B planning, is to, for example, prepare 3 budgets. So the idea here is at the outset of a project, or a program or an activity or an event or whatnot, you create essentially, and if there is uncertainty, remember we talked about the indicators. When there is uncertainty about factors that you cannot control, if you actually can control everything, then this is just a workmate project. Then you don't need to do this. But let's say you're doing something in the community, or with a partner organization, that could be an idea. So essentially you provide 3, it can be tabs in an Excel with a best case, a mid case, and a worst case scenario of a budget. So for example, in terms of revenue that you're taking in if you're running an event, or funding if you, for example, have applied to different funding sources, or maybe if another collaborating organization is also putting in money. All these kinds of uncertainties, those you can put in, and that helps you to assess, okay, for example, in the both mid case as well as worst case, we could actually run over our budget quite considerably. So what does that mean? How can we prevent this? So either you need to up your resources that you're dedicating to this, or maybe there might be other strategies. Again, this is not an end in itself. This is just a tool to facilitate your thinking, your conversations at the level of maybe the leadership team or the organization, because strategic thinking and talking is not a prerogative of the board. Collectively, as organizations, we need to be flexing our strategic muscle a lot more, because it's so related to resilience.
So what you're suggesting, just so I can clarify, is the board needs to look at this as well as the employees or the leadership of the organization and the operational front. It's having that alignment. Is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, it can be tiered. I mean, of course, I'm not necessarily, I think, suggesting to have as an annual operational budget to have 3 different versions, although maybe that is what is helpful for your organization, but more maybe at a project level or a program level, as you plan out, because sometimes programs, projects that can be over a year, 2 years, and it is uncertain how it will go, and that might just help you. So as you plan, for example, you do your maybe terms of reference, or you maybe hire people, or you get your volunteers in order. The same you would do with the budget, to have those budgets, again, as a tool to help facilitate and kickstart conversations. Because again, budgets are always tools. They're never ends in themselves. They should not be straitjackets. I know this is oftentimes a cause for a lot of headache and concern for many nonprofit leaders, but they should not be scary. They should be tools.
Very true. I'm going to share like kind of a flip perspective too, because as a consultant and a contractor, my consulting group is sometimes helping organizations with the opposite. Right now, there is funding. People are being injected with provincial, federal funds, special donations. It's also a great time to make some great work happen. So, as with any crises, there are silver linings. Again, another catchphrase we're talking a lot about these days. So from my perspective as a consultant, here are some tips I can provide your organization. I always try to provide nonprofits with a tiered proposal when I'm giving them a quote for a project. Not only does that help me think about like, okay, where can I be flexible? But then it means we have a contract or a base of statement of work that we can shift to as the project progresses based on the needs, right? The other nice thing is that sometimes we know what our budget is. Like, let's say we get an X amount, it's already sitting in the nonprofit account, but we want to create different scenarios for how we might use it on the project. And so sometimes asking your external contractors to create a tiered approach or a flexible approach is another great way for your organization to get the most out of your external outsourcing resources. So that's just my tip, and it's something that I strongly advocate for when I'm working with nonprofits, that they should be requesting this of contractors. Let's move to the second activity. I don't want to take up too much time on each one, but this is a great one. How about tell us a little bit about this, Catarina?
Yeah, so, and you can, this is obviously to be customized as well, but this is another technique that as you set out to plan maybe a project, a program, or an event, to do something like a risk log and think about the mitigation strategies. So this goes a little bit into the direction of the question that was just posted. Obviously, you can never plan for all the things that can happen. You can just try to assess the existing threats or risks that might be out there, and do the drills that Leah was talking about earlier on. Play it through when you're not with your back against the wall, so that you can react better, and you've done some of that thinking already when you were not in stress mode. So using a very straightforward example here is you're organizing an in-person training event for volunteers. Regular occurrence for many nonprofits. So you plan this out for the year, and the threads should have a T, not a D there. So thinking about the threats that might be out there to running a successful training event is you might have low sign up. Okay, how probable is that, and what's the consequence? It is medium likelihood that it might be low sign up, but the consequence is quite large, because it's essentially a waste of resources if you only have 2-3 people show up, and you've booked the room, you've gotten maybe some refreshments and whatnot. Then you think through, okay, how can we mitigate that? And that can include things that you might actually then want to do, or even just options that you might have as an option when you're in the situation and the threat has come to fruition. So for example, with the low sign up, you might actually promote on multiple channels to reach more people, to bring in more volunteers or potential volunteers. You might condense sessions. You might also move to certain digital components. So maybe having part in person, part digital. And then in the column where it says decisions, these might be some notes or decisions, or setting out, okay, when do we make those decisions? Do we check in every month in our regular program meeting? Or if something happens, then we do that. You know, you can customize it and do your own notes there. Other threats, just examples, for example, facilitator instructor is unavailable, or COVID restrictions tighten. Again, you do a quick analysis of how likely is it, how great would be the consequence. You brainstorm some risks, and those might just live in that document, or they might actually open up other things you might want to be doing. So for example, out of this analysis, if that had been me, one concrete task that would have come out from my team would be, okay, actually the comms team person, volunteers, need to be promoting much more aggressively to make sure we get as much exposure as possible. But yeah, summarizing, this is just a tool to help you have some of those conversations. It will not cover all the eventualities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. It's really great to have examples. I mean, this is one that we're all going through. Another way that I can respond to the questions we've been seeing in the chat is we do have some specific training on how to shift to digital events. What are some different ways that you can continue hosting these events, but still getting sponsorship and still measuring the impact of those? So we'll talk about those at the end, but they're also available on our website. Let's just do a few other activities. This is one relating to the mental models, or how to avoid cognitive tunneling, essentially. So one recommendation is use storytelling, use narration, and use those dreaming meetings to actually describe what are some of the situations we might face. And then, just as we did earlier, what does that feel like? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What are some things we should notice and keep our eyes out for to avoid that cognitive tunneling and the spotlight on one thing? So, some of those things are to continue doing drills, walking through scenarios with your team, build that into the daily rhythm of your organization. It could be maybe every single board meeting, you have a little discussion about that. Every single team meeting or weekly meeting or check-in, maybe you build a little bit of that resiliency muscle, repetition, right? Also, you want to make sure you're doing that in both practiced, relaxed states. So when things are going fairly well, chugging along, and when things are stressful, and that can be very hard to do. So again, it takes practice. So make sure you're talking about this on a regular cadence with your team. And lastly, here's one that, there's so many models out there for contingency planning. If you just Google risk management plan, contingency planning, and there's lots of great ones out there, but pick one that you like, could resonate with you visually, or maybe has great content. Make sure you're picking one that might also be more nonprofit focused in nature, because sometimes the business models, the corporate models don't always match, right? And we've seen that. But select one that works for you, and then together as an organization, even at all levels, perhaps identify which are the areas that we want to focus in on. And then as a team, as a group, workshop that, decide together, and plan ahead using some of these activities we're suggesting, risk mitigation, risk planning, risk solutions. The idea is we need to be able to mentally see how we would get through a situation in order for us to actually do it successfully, right? One strategy, and I'm sure you've seen this already, is take a look at your digital technology and your infrastructure in terms of how are you connecting with people, how are you delivering knowledge, what's that knowledge transfer technology looking like? And as a learning professional, we do a lot of this. We've been working in learning management systems, Zoom, video hosting for decades. If you need help, give us a call. If your organization doesn't have webinar software or learning management system, or even websites that can host these things, then you definitely won't be passing the crisis anytime soon. And so one way to get over that is to do some assessment, get some help from external contractors. We are well versed in this, and make it part of your strategic plan as well, in terms of how are you continually looking at these things in a proactive way instead of being reactive. So if you want to chat about learning management systems or online learning development, we're here to support. And you're not alone. Lots of people are going through this right now. We're just going to wrap up right now. We want to know if there's other crisis management techniques that you'd like to recommend. This is a community. We can learn from each other. Feel free to share those in the chat. We definitely didn't cover everything today, but here's what we did cover. We wanted to look at crisis as something that's recurring. And whether you see it as linear or if you see it as cyclical, the idea is to build that resiliency muscle in your team, on your board, and your volunteers and your employees, so that we can be prepared in advance. And that takes practice. And the neuroscience behind it is very clear. That contingency planning is about being as prepared and proactive as possible so that we avoid that cognitive tunneling. And finally, we hope that you can reach us or other consultants for help. You're not alone. There's great communities out there. Ignite Management is where you can find Catarina. And of course, you can find us at Leah Chang Learning. We offer nonprofit courses for this very topic. We offer sponsorship packages and how to measure impact. And those are the courses that talk specifically about how to shift your events and your programming to the new digital world that we're in today. And it gives you some very clear and concrete scenarios. So do check those out. They're very low cost, low barrier, but high quality. And they're online for you. You can purchase them anytime. So Catarina, are people able to email you, connect with you on Facebook or LinkedIn? What's the best way?
Yeah, probably via the email that's on there, or also LinkedIn. Great, just reach out.
Fantastic. Also, if you're in the lower mainland of British Columbia, Catarina and I are very active in the meetup groups, especially the Tech for Good, Net 2 Squared, the Vancouver one. And you can find me on LinkedIn or on my website. My team's got lots of expertise to share. So we hope you connect with us. We do have another webinar coming up. This is more of a case study. We'll be talking with our partners from Leah HR, who are diversity and inclusion specialists and consultants. And Kristen Bauer and Annika and I work together to design content for diversity and inclusion training, unconscious bias training, and we're doing a lot of leadership development right now in that space. So if you'd like to hear about our learnings, our tips, and also see what we've been working on, we invite you to join us on Thursday, November 19th. So thanks again to our sponsor at LearnUpon Learning Management System. And thank you for joining us. If we didn't get to your questions today, we will be doing so by email afterwards. Any parting words, Catarina?
No, that was awesome, super fun. I hope it was helpful, and thanks for doing this, Leah.
Thank you for joining us. Take care, everybody. Stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.